my favorite movies is the movie The Shawshank Redemption. Highly recommend it, not necessarily family viewing though. It tells the story of a man named Andy Dufresne who is wrongfully convicted of a terrible crime, and he's sent to life imprisonment in a very austere and barbaric institution called Shawshank Prison. And at a critical moment in the movie, Andy has a conversation with his friend Red. He says this, he says, "Red, either you got to get busy living or get busy dying." See, Andy knew that life is really static. It's either going in one direction or the other. We're either moving towards life or away from life. Jesus said in John's Gospel, "I came that they may have life and have it to the full." See, Jesus wants us to get busy living. This weekend we heard the parable of the talents from Matthew's Gospel. And I believe that this parable gives us 4 key principles that will help us to get busy living in all the dimensions of our life, in our relational areas of our life, our personal life, our spiritual life, and our communal life. Let's look at these 4 principles briefly. Number 1, the first principle is this: we are stewards, not owners. We are stewards and not owners. You see, in the parable, the master gives his property to his slaves to take care of. It's his property. It belongs to the master. It doesn't belong to the slaves. And this is usually where we get things wrong. When we begin to think that the things that are in our lives, the people in our lives, are ours. We forget that they are a gift. We forget that everything is a gift. The relationships in our life, they're gifts. The abilities and talents that we have are gifts. And even the freedom and the environment that we grew up in that allowed us to develop these talents, that this was a gift as well. The spiritual life is a gift. The life of grace is a gift. Salvation is a gift in our parish. This communal life of the parish, it's all a gift. It doesn't belong to us. We are not owners. All is a gift. That's the first principle. The second principle is that the gift we have been given is of great value. The master gave to one servant 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. And when I used to think about this parable, I'd imagine the master calling his 3 slaves and fishing into his pocket and dropping a few coins in their hand, because a talent was it's a form of currency. Actually, a talent was a measure of weight. And most commonly, it was a measure of weight in silver. So here's the thing: 1 talent in silver was the equivalent of more than 15 years' wages of a laborer. That's about $600,000. I mean, that's not chump change, is it? And that's the guy who got 1. The guy who got 5 basically was given the equivalent of $3 million. This is not loose change. And it reminds us that the gifts that we've been given are of incredible value. And how often do we forget the value of what we've been given? How often do we take things for granted? Do we take one another for granted? I mean, what is the value of a great friend, a true friend? What's the value of a loving spouse, a dear parent, a child? Remember the old MasterCard commercial? Priceless, priceless. What's the value of the gifts and talents that we've been given? And by the way, the word talent in the English language, meaning ability, actually comes from this parable. Different meaning. They took the original meaning of it being a unit of weight and gave it the meaning that it has today in our English language. And yet, how often do we take our own abilities and gifts and talents for granted? We fail to see them for what they are. What about the spiritual life, our faith? Do we even consider it to be of value? Sometimes the danger is that we can forget the riches that we have through faith. And even with the life of our parish, we can assess its value only in as much as it somehow meets our needs readily and conveniently. So if we wish to live life to the full, we need to not only see that everything is a gift, but we need to ask the Lord to help us to see the true value of that gift. That's the second point. The third point is that the master expects a return on his investment. It's clear from the parable. The man who made who was given 5 talents produced 5. The man who was given 2 produced 2. The master expected it. And so he's very harsh towards the one that buried it in the ground. We need to ask ourselves, what is growing? Where am I experiencing growth in my life? Am I growing in my relationships? Am I growing in my own talents and abilities? What about in the spiritual life? Have I been stagnating? And in the life of our parish, I mean, there's a great challenge for us, because in the life of our parish, not only have we been staying steady, not only have we not been growing, but our 1 talent or our 5 talents has been greatly diminished. The Lord expects a return on his gifts. And if we seek to live life to the full, to experience life to the full, to get busy living, we need to not only see everything as a gift of great value, but we need to be intentional about actually growing what we've received, to be intentional about it. And finally, the 4th point, the kind of faith that is needed to grow the gifts that have been given to us is a faith that is spelled R-I-S-K, not S-A-F-E. You see, the man who was given the 1 talent, he buried his talent in the ground because he didn't want to risk. He didn't want to risk losing it. He was afraid. He was paralyzed by fear. But you see, unless we risk, we will never grow something. As St. Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, he says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. You will reap what you sow." And sowing, putting something in the ground so that it dies is always a great risk. It's also an act of faith. There's an act of faith as I sow something in the ground that it will actually yield a harvest. It's a hope. It's an act of faith. There's no absolute certainty that it will produce a harvest. But the only way to grow something is to risk something. And so I invite you to reflect this week on this question. What is growing in my life? What is not growing? What is in fact diminishing in my personal life, in my relationships, in my spiritual life, and in the life of the parish? Where am I paralyzed by fear? Where am I afraid to take a risk? And where is God calling me to take a risk? Perhaps in our relationships, there is a relationship that we need to invest in. There's maybe a relationship that needs to be healed, some area of reconciliation. Maybe there's a difficult and uncomfortable conversation that we know that we need to have, but we've been putting it off. What about in my personal life with my own gifts and abilities? Are we feeling a nudge to grow and develop a gift? Is there a gift that I'm keeping secret, keeping to myself, that I haven't shared with people, that I've perhaps buried in the ground, that I need to dig up? What about in my spiritual life? Where am I being called to invest, to grow, to step out of my comfort zone? Is there a call to a deeper prayer life, a deeper embrace of what it means to follow Jesus, to grow? Because this is what it really means to be a disciple. Is there perhaps a call to let go of an unhealthy pattern of behavior, an area of a struggle with sin in our lives? And finally, in the life of the parish, what about a call to step out of the box, to risk something, to get involved so that we can move our parish from a direction of decline to one of health and fruitfulness? I started this reflection by speaking about my favorite movie, Shawshank Redemption. Spoiler alert. So when Andy had this conversation with his friend Red, when he said either you got to be busy, get busy either living or dying, that very day, Andy would take a great risk, and he actually would break out of prison and obtain his freedom. And he did this because he made a decision to get busy living. Jesus said, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full."